There are stories that shake the world, stories that don't just inspire. They ignite something inside us, something raw, something restless, something that whispers, "If he could do it, so can you." This is one of those stories, a story born in the shadows of rejection, raised through the fire of obsession, forged in the storms of failure, and carried forward by a mind that refused to bend. This is not the story of a perfect man. It is the story of a relentless rebel, a misfit, a troublemaker, a visionary who saw the world not as it was, but as it could be. A man who didn't just think differently, he lived differently, he worked differently, he failed differently, and he rose differently. This is the story of Steve Jobs, the genius who refused to quit, the impossible thinker, the restless dreamer, the force of nature who rebuilt entire industries, with nothing but a stubborn belief that he could change the world, and he did. But the world never saw the broken pieces behind the genius. The pain, the abandonment, the rejection, the failures so deep. They almost destroyed him, because before he became the Steve Jobs we all know, the black turtleneck icon, the billionaire creator, the man who turned Apple into the most valuable brand on earth, he was just a boy searching for belonging, a boy searching for identity, a boy searching for something worth fighting for, and what happened in those early years would shape everything that came after. So let us begin, not with the legend, but with the child, the abandoned child, who would one day become the most unstoppable visionary of his generation. Steve Jobs didn't enter this world gently. He entered it through a storm of decisions he never chose, a storm of emotions he never saw, a storm of circumstances he never understood. He was born to a mother who felt she couldn't keep him, born into a world that didn't seem to want him, born into a life already marked by separation, adopted at birth. The very first chapter of his life was stamped by the feeling of being unwanted. And that feeling never fully left him. Paul and Clara Jobs took him into their small, humble home. They weren't rich, they weren't influential, but they gave him something. Far more important, they gave him a place to belong. At least on the surface, because deep inside, Steve carried a quiet fire, a restlessness, a hunger to prove something. Not to the world, but to himself. He didn't know why he felt different, he just did. School bored him, rules trapped him. The ordinary suffocated him. Teachers saw him as a troublemaker. Classmates saw him as strange. Even adults couldn't understand why this small boy refused to sit still, refused to follow instructions, refused to accept the world the way it was handed to him. He wasn't trying to rebel. He simply couldn't live inside the limits others tried to place around him. He questioned everything. He challenged everyone. He defied expectations. Not because he wanted attention, but because his mind simply operated on a different frequency. While other children played outside, Steve opened machines just to see how they worked. While other kids listened to teachers, Steve challenged them when something didn't make sense. While others accepted reality, Steve tried to redesign it. He wasn't meant to fit in. He wasn't built for ordinary life. He wasn't wired to follow the path laid out for him. He was born to create his own path, even if he didn't know it yet. And like every great story, the people who enter your life at the right moment can change everything. For Steve, that person was Paul Jobs. Paul wasn't a scientist. He wasn't an engineer, but he was a craftsman, a man who believed that every object had a soul, a meaning, a purpose. And he taught Steve something that would define the rest of his life. Whatever you build it beautifully, even the parts no one sees. Those words became the blueprint of Apple, because Steve didn't create products. He crafted experiences, he shaped emotions, he carved meaning into machines. He believed technology should feel like art, and that belief had its roots in a small garage in Los Altos, California. But Steve's childhood was not all warm memories and fatherly lessons, because no matter how loving his adoptive parents were, the wound of being abandoned continued to follow him. When he discovered the truth that his birth parents had given him away, he didn't get angry. He felt broken. He felt incomplete. He felt like a mistake that the world didn't want, and that wound became the engine of his ambition. He needed to prove that he mattered, that he had value, that he wasn't disposable, that the world was wrong. To ever doubt his worth, that wound would push him to greatness, but it would also push him into darkness, because some dreams are born not from inspiration, but from pain. But what came next would set the stage for one of the greatest partnerships in the history of innovation. As Steve entered his teenage years, he became even more difficult to contain. He wasn't interested in sports. He wasn't interested in popularity. He wasn't interested in anything. That didn't awaken his curiosity. And then he met the machine that would change his life, the computer back then. Computers weren't sleek, beautiful, or friendly. They were giant, humming monsters that lived in labs and corporations. But to Steve, they weren't machines. They were possibilities, pieces of the future, waiting to be unlocked. And while most people saw complexity, he saw potential. He felt a strange calling toward this new frontier of creativity. But as powerful as that curiosity was, Steve lacked something essential. He had the vision, he had the imagination, he had the fire, but he didn't have the technical skill to bring those visions to life, not yet. That missing piece was about to appear in the form of a skinny, introverted, brilliant young engineer named Steve Wozniak. Woz was gentle, kind, humble, a genius who never needed fame. He only wanted to build things. Jobs was intense, unpredictable, fearless, a genius who wanted to change the world. They were opposites. And that's why they worked. One day, Woz showed Steve a small device he had built, a computer-like machine that could do things unheard of at the time. And for the first time in his life, Steve saw something not just powerful, but revolutionary, a machine for the people, a computer for everyone, a bridge between imagination and reality. And in that moment, Steve Jobs made a decision that would change everything. He would dedicate his life to building the future, not for corporations, not for scientists, not for the elite, but for ordinary people, for dreamers, for creators, for misfits like him. His path was clear, but the world wasn't ready, because before he could rise to greatness, he would walk through storms designed to break him. College didn't tame him either. In fact, it exposed the gap between who he was and who the world expected him to be. Steve wasn't built for classrooms. He wasn't built for traditional learning. He needed freedom. He needed discomfort. He needed chaos. Within months, he dropped out of Reed College, not because he was lazy, but because he felt trapped. He felt guilty for wasting his parents' money on classes he didn't believe in. But dropping out didn't solve his problems. It created more. He slept on floors. He ate free meals from temples. He lived without stability, without direction, without any clear idea of where he was supposed to go. He wasn't a genius yet. He wasn't a millionaire. He wasn't a visionary. He was just a young man, trying to find himself, searching, questioning, exploring, and in that struggle, he discovered things that would later shape his empire. A calligraphy class that taught him beauty, a spiritual journey that taught him simplicity, a season of poverty that taught him hunger, but hunger alone doesn't create greatness. It only creates the need. Greatness comes when hunger meets opportunity, and for Steve Jobs, that opportunity would be born in a small garage behind his parents' home, where the first seeds of Apple were about to be planted. But the world had no idea what was coming, because the struggles he faced next were nothing compared to the storms that were waiting for him. The world saw an odd young dropout with wild ideas and no clear future. But inside Steve, something was awakening, a belief, a certainty, a truth he could no longer ignore. He was not meant to work for anyone. He was meant to build something the world had never seen. But wanting greatness and creating greatness are two different things, and Steve Jobs was about to learn how cruel the gap can be. The world loves to talk about Steve Jobs' success. The world loves the polished version of greatness, but what the world rarely sees is the wreckage behind the victories. Because before Steve Jobs became a legend, he was broken, crushed, humiliated, publicly stripped of the very company he built, from the dirt beneath his shoes. But his fall didn't begin at the top. It began slowly. In the cracks, in the pressure, in the conflicts that started small and grew into storms. When Apple began to rise, Steve was still young, brilliant, yes, creative, yes, but unpolished, unrefined, explosive, demanding, impossible to predict. His intensity was both his gift and his curse. He pushed people beyond their limits. He demanded excellence with no mercy. He believed the impossible was simply something people hadn't tried hard enough to achieve. But not everyone could handle that fire. As Apple grew, so did the friction. Teams complained. Managers resisted. Board members worried, investors panicked, and the company Steve built, with vision and fire, began to push back against him. The Macintosh team, his pride, his obsession, his heart, had become his battlefield. The Macintosh wasn't just a product to him. It was his soul. It was beauty, simplicity, artistry, rebellion, all wrapped into a machine. That would change the world, but building something revolutionary always comes at a cost. Deadlines were missed, budgets exploded, teams were exhausted, arguments erupted, and Steve, in his desperate pursuit of perfection, kept pushing harder. He didn't know how to stop. He didn't know how to compromise. He didn't know how to slow down. He only knew how to chase the future, as if it were running away from him, and that intensity began to scare the board. Apple was growing fast, but so was the chaos. The board thought they needed someone to control the fire, someone older, someone calmer, someone more manageable, so they brought in John Sculley, a polished, respected CEO. From Pepsi, Steve admired him at first. He believed Sculley would understand. He believed Sculley would help him build the future. He believed Sculley would stand beside him, but the truth was far more painful because John Sculley was not there to follow Steve's vision. He was there to contain it. The conflict between them grew quietly at first, then loudly, then violently. Sculley wanted structure. Steve wanted freedom. Sculley wanted predictability. Steve wanted magic. Sculley wanted balance. Steve wanted revolution. Two worlds collided. Only one would survive, and then came the betrayal. A meeting, a vote, a decision. Steve never saw coming. The board sided with Sculley. They removed Steve from his own project. They pushed him out of the company he created. They silenced his voice. They exiled the visionary. The news hit the world like a shock. But the pain that hit Steve was far worse, because how do you survive being fired from your own dream? How do you breathe when the very thing that gave you purpose has been taken away? How do you stand when your identity has been shattered by the company you gave your entire youth to build? That was Steve's darkest moment, not the failure, not the rejection, not the humiliation, but the silence that followed, the emptiness, the loss of meaning, the feeling of being nothing. Everything he poured into Apple, his heart, his vision, his fire, was thrown aside. The world continued. The company moved on, and Steve Jobs, the young visionary, disappeared. He walked alone. He wondered who he truly was. Without Apple, he questioned every decision, every instinct, every belief. The genius was now the failure. The leader was now the outsider. The founder was now the exile. But what he didn't know was this: sometimes life breaks you, not to destroy you, but to rebuild you, stronger than you ever imagined. Because what Steve Jobs did next, no one could have predicted, not even him. When Steve left Apple, he had two choices: give up the dream, or rebuild it from scratch. And Steve Jobs was never born to quit. He didn't know where he was going. He didn't know what the future held. But he knew one thing: he was still Steve Jobs, and Steve Jobs was built to create. So he returned to the only thing that ever gave him life: building the future. He founded NeXT, a company born not from ambition, but from survival. NeXT wasn't meant to compete with Apple. It wasn't meant to change the world. It was simply Steve trying to rediscover himself. But even in exile, his genius refused to be silent. NeXT computers were ahead of their time, too advanced, too expensive, too brilliant for the world to appreciate yet. And while NeXT struggled to survive, something else extraordinary happened. Steve acquired a small animation company, one that most people saw as worthless, a tiny studio with outdated technology and no real future. Steve didn't buy it for business. He bought it for curiosity, for intuition, for the whisper of possibility. That studio was called Pixar, and Steve had no idea that he had just stepped into one of the greatest success stories in entertainment history. But success didn't come quickly. Pixar almost died again and again and again. Money was burning, projects were failing, the studio was hanging by a thread. But then, a miracle disguised itself as a simple idea: a fully computer-animated movie. Something no one had ever done, something studios refused to fund, something experts said would fail. But Steve believed. He saw the spark. He saw the magic. He saw the future. And Pixar created Toy Story, a film that didn't just succeed, it redefined animation forever. Pixar exploded, Hollywood changed, and Steve Jobs The man Apple threw away became a billionaire. But this was only the beginning, because while Steve was rebuilding his life, Apple was falling apart. The company that had exiled him was now directionless, bleeding money, losing identity, and desperately searching for someone to save it. And the answer was the very man they had pushed out. Apple was dying, and only one man could bring it back to life. The moment Steve Jobs walked back into Apple, everything changed. He didn't come as a defeated founder. He came as a transformed visionary. Sharper, wiser, more focused, more dangerous. He found Apple bloated, cluttered, confused, lost in its own noise. Dozens of failing products, no direction, no identity, no soul. And Steve did something that horrified the entire company. He cut everything, all the products, all the distractions, all the noise. He reduced Apple's product line from dozens to 4. He wasn't trying to save a company. He was trying to resurrect an idea. Make technology simple, make technology beautiful, make technology human. His return was not gentle, it was not quiet, it was not easy. He clashed with teams, he made brutal decisions. He fired people who doubted him, he rebuilt Apple from its foundation, and then he unveiled the first great symbol of the new Apple, the iMac, a computer that wasn't beige, boring, or cold. It was colorful, playful, simple, inviting. A machine that said, technology can be fun. The world fell in love, and with that single product, Apple began its rise, from near bankruptcy to global domination. But Steve wasn't done, not even close, because inside him was still the same boy who dreamed of creating the future. So he asked the question that changed everything: what's next? The answer was something no one expected: a music device, 1,000 songs in your pocket. People laughed, experts doubted, competitors ignored him. But then the iPod launched, and the music industry would never be the same. Millions of people around the world suddenly carried Apple in their hands, but Steve still wasn't. And Steve Jobs had more vision than anyone alive. The iPhone exploded into the world. Lines around buildings, news headlines, competitors stunned, consumers transformed. And then came the App Store, a digital universe that changed business forever. The iPhone became the center of life, the heart of communication, the gateway to the digital world. But Steve wasn't finished. Next came the iPad, a device everyone mocked, until it redefined computing. Then came the MacBook Air, then iOS upgrades, then Apple stores, then iCloud, then the complete redesign of Apple. He didn't build products, he built ecosystems. He built worlds, he built experiences that reshaped human behavior. Success surrounded him, praise followed him. Billions flowed into Apple, but behind the applause was a truth the world didn't see. Steve was running out of time. His greatest triumphs were arriving. At the same moment, his health began to fail. The world saw a visionary, but his body was quietly collapsing, and what he faced next was the greatest battle of his life. Apple didn't just become successful, it became a global force, a cultural shift, a symbol of the future, because one man refused to see technology as metal and wires. To Steve, technology was emotion, connection, possibility, a bridge between human beings and the world they hoped to create. By the late 2000s, Apple was no longer the underdog fighting to survive. It was the empire that ruled the digital age. Stores in every major city, products in every home, software in every pocket, a brand recognized in every corner of the planet. But Apple's empire wasn't defined by its size, it was defined by its philosophy: simplicity, elegance, humanity, purpose, experience. This wasn't a company that followed the market, this was a company that created the market. Every product was a statement, every launch was a cultural event, every keynote was a moment the world stopped to witness. Apple didn't just sell devices, it sold a lifestyle, a feeling, a belief that technology should feel like magic. But what people didn't see was the cost of building that magic. Behind every product, behind every breakthrough, behind every release, Steve was fighting a war inside his own body. Cancer, a word sharp enough to cut through even the strongest heart. He tried to hide it, he tried to outrun it, he tried to control it, the way he controlled his company. But cancer doesn't negotiate. His empire grew. As his strength faded, his innovations expanded. As his body weakened, his influence soared. As his time shrank, yet he refused to stop. He still walked the stage. He still spoke with fire. He still pushed teams beyond what they believed possible. People saw a visionary. They didn't see the hidden under the black turtleneck. They didn't see the nights he couldn't sleep, the days he couldn't eat, the moments he wondered if his time was almost over. But even then, even while dying, Steve Jobs pushed the world forward. Because to him, life wasn't measured in years. It was measured in impact. But the greatest chapter of his legacy was not written by his hands. It was written by the world he transformed. When we speak of Steve Jobs today, we don't speak of a businessman, we don't speak of a CEO, we don't even speak of an inventor. We speak of a phenomenon, a spark, a revolution that changed the course of human history. His legacy is not measured in billions. It is measured in the billions of lives touched by his creations, the smartphones in our pockets, the laptops on our desks, the music we stream, the films we watch, the apps we depend on, the digital world we navigate. Steve Jobs reshaped all of it. He didn't just improve technology, he redefined it. He didn't just design products, he designed the future. He didn't just build a company. He built a culture, one that demanded excellence, simplicity, beauty, and purpose. But perhaps the most powerful part of Steve's legacy is something the world often forgets. He failed. He suffered, he was doubted, he was rejected, he was fired. He was broken, he was told no, more times than yes. And still, he rose. His legacy teaches us that greatness is not talent, greatness is not intelligence, greatness is not luck. Greatness is refusal, the refusal to quit, the refusal to settle, the refusal to stop. When the world tells you you're done, Steve's life was not perfect, but his determination was. He made mistakes. He made enemies. He pushed people too hard. He lost relationships. He sacrificed balance. He sacrificed comfort because vision demands sacrifice, and Steve Jobs paid the price willingly. But his legacy was not in the sacrifices. It was in the courage to pursue an idea long before the world understood it. His final years became a race against time, a race between a deteriorating body and a mind still bursting with impossible ideas. And yet, even knowing the end was near, he kept creating, he kept dreaming, he kept building. Because to Steve, as long as he was alive, the future was still within reach. And in the end, he left behind a message more powerful than every product he ever created. Steve Jobs didn't succeed because he was intelligent. He didn't succeed because he was talented. He didn't succeed because he had advantages. He succeeded because of how he thought, because of what he believed, because of the mindset that shaped every decision he made. Here are the truths that defined his genius. 1. Reality is negotiable. If the world said something was impossible, Steve asked why. Rules didn't stop him. Limitations didn't scare him. He believed that reality was flexible, and he spent his life bending it. 2. Details matter. To most people, details are small. To Steve, details were everything. He believed that even the invisible parts should be beautiful. Even the unseen parts should be crafted with care, because excellence isn't what people see, it's what they feel. 3. Make things simple. The world complicates everything. Steve simplified it. He believed that simplicity is the ultimate sophistication, and he fought ruthlessly to remove everything that didn't matter. 4. Follow your curiosity. Steve never followed trends. He followed intuition. He followed sparks. He followed the things that made him feel alive. Curiosity was his compass. Imagination was his roadmap. 5. Don't live someone else's life. In his most famous speech, he said, "Your time is limited, so don't waste it living someone else's life." He understood that society tries to mold you, shape you, limit you, but greatness comes when you refuse to be shaped by anyone but yourself. 6. Stay hungry. Stay foolish. This wasn't a slogan, it was his identity. Hungry for progress, hungry for change, hungry for meaning. Foolish enough to attempt the impossible. Foolish enough to challenge the world. Foolish enough to bet everything on a belief no one else understood. This mindset didn't just build Apple, it built a movement, a philosophy that continues to guide millions long after Steve is gone. And that brings us to the final chapter, the final message, the final breath of a man who changed everything. On October 5th, 2011, the world stopped, the color drained from screens, the noise of the internet fell quiet. The heartbeat of innovation faltered Steve Jobs, was gone, but here is the truth. He did not leave us empty, he left us with a challenge, a final whisper, to every dreamer, every creator, every misfit, every rebel who feels different, strange, out of place, a whisper that said, the world was built by people, no smarter than you. A whisper that said, everything around you was created by someone who refused to quit. A whisper that said, if you want to change the world, you can. His death did not close his story, it multiplied it today. Every time we swipe a screen, every time we FaceTime a loved one, every time we use technology that feels effortless and alive, we are touching the echo of Steve Jobs' mind. His story became a reminder that one person, just one, can shift the entire direction of humanity, not because they are perfect, but because they are relentless, because they refuse to back down, refuse to surrender, refuse to let the world define their limits. Steve Jobs was not a god, not a saint, not a flawless hero. He was a human being, a man with faults, mistakes, pain, and doubts, but he took that humanity and turned it into power, into vision, into destiny. And so now, as this story comes to its final breath, you must ask yourself,